You know that feeling, right? After a really hard workout or maybe just a super long day where you just feel empty.
Yeah, like the tank is completely dry.
Exactly, like your personal power plug has been pulled. Well, that feeling, it actually comes down to the real energy money in your body, this molecule called adenosine triphosphate, ATP.
That's the one. And look, it sounds technical, maybe like something you vaguely remember from biology class,
Hmm.
but ATP is, well, it's everything.
Hmm.
This deep dive today is all about getting why it's so fundamental.
Right, understanding how it powers, pretty much everything we do, whether you're an elite athlete or just curious about how your body ticks.
hmm From lifting a weight to your heart beating, even just thinking relies on it.
So to really dig into this, we pulled together some quite interesting sources. We've got a YouTube video talking training zones and energy.
Which is quite practical.
Yeah. And then there's a Biology LibreText page that really breaks down ATP itself, the definition from Encyclopedia Britannica, always good for the basics.
Foundational stuff.
Plus, some research papers looking at exercise metabolism, how our bodies use energy when we move, and even specific studies on ATP and things like sprinting versus, say, marathon running.
A real mix, from the basics to the application.
So the mission for us today, our goal for this deep dive, is to really unpack the main roles ATP plays in our cells, throughout our bodies. What do these sources tell us is the big picture?
Exactly. We want everyone listening to walk away with a really solid grasp of how this one tiny molecule fuels, well, essentially all of life's processes.
Okay, let's start right there then. ATP, we keep saying energy currency. What does that actually mean in simple terms?
Think of it like this. You have different kinds of fuel, right? Wood, coal, gasoline. But maybe your car only runs on gasoline. ATP is the gasoline for your cells. It's the form of energy almost all cellular machinery is designed to use directly.
Okay, the universal fuel type.
Precisely. Its structure involves an adenosine molecule linked to 3 phosphate groups. Now, the real magic, the energy release, happens when one of those phosphate groups gets broken off.
How does that work?
It's a process called hydrolysis. Hydro means water. Lysis means splitting. So water is involved in breaking that bond, specifically the bond holding the last phosphate group on.
Ah, okay.
And when that bond breaks, pop. It releases a packet of usable energy. It's like releasing a tightly coiled spring.
And the cell captures that released energy to do whatever it needs to do.
Exactly. Whatever work the cell needs to perform, building something, moving something, sending a signal, that released energy powers it.
So when ATP releases energy, what's left?
You're left with ADP adenosine diphosphate, meaning only 2 phosphates left, and a loose phosphate group.
Okay, ADP. Is that the end of the story?
Oh, definitely not. That would be incredibly inefficient. The beauty is that it's a cycle. The cell takes that ADP and the loose phosphate, and using energy it gets from breaking down food, carbohydrates, fats, proteins.
The fuel we eat.
Right. It uses that energy to stick the phosphate back onto the ADP, reforming ATP. So it's constantly being broken down for energy and then rebuilt, recharged, ready to go again.
Like a rechargeable battery. Use it, recharge it, use it again.
That's a perfect analogy.
Hmm.
It's the ATP-ADP cycle. And it happens incredibly fast and constantly in our cells.
Whoa. And you mentioned something, an enzyme that does the rebuilding.
Yes, the main enzyme responsible for making most of our ATP is called ATP synthase. It's this amazing molecular machine.
Where does it live?
Primarily in the mitochondria. You always hear mitochondria called the powerhouses of the cell.
Yeah, that rings a bell.
Well, this is why. ATP synthase is embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, and it uses the energy derived from food breakdown, specifically through a process involving electron transport and oxygen, to churn out huge amounts of ATP.
So mitochondria are ATP factories, essentially.
They really are. In plant cells, chloroplasts also have ATP synthase for photosynthesis. But in us, it's mainly the mitochondria doing the heavy lifting for energy production from food.
It's amazing to think this whole fundamental energy process was really figured out. When was it?
The central role of ATP, how it links energy release from food to energy use by the cell, that was largely established back in 1941 by Fritz Lippmann and Hermann Kalkar. They got Nobel Prizes for related work. It was foundational.
Okay, that sets the stage nicely. ATP is the cellular fuel, constantly recycled, made mostly in the mitochondria. Now, let's connect it to something really tangible. Muscle movement. How does ATP make our muscles contract?
Right. Muscle contraction is a huge energy consumer. When a nerve signal tells a muscle fiber to contract, ATP provides the direct energy for the mechanical process.
What's the process?
It involves proteins inside the muscle fibers called actin and myosin. Think of them like tiny ropes and hooks. ATP binds to myosin, the hook, causing it to detach from actin, the rope. Then the breakdown of that ATP, the hydrolysis we talked about, provides the energy for the myosin head to change shape, recock, and then grab onto the actin again further down.
Pulling the rope, basically.
Exactly. It pulls the actin filament, causing the muscle fiber to shorten or contract. This cycle repeats over and over as long as the muscle needs to contract and has ATP available. It's called the sliding filament theory, powered by ATP hydrolysis at each step.
So every little twitch, every movement burns through ATP directly at the myosin heads.
Yes, but here's the catch. The amount of ATP just readily available, free-floating in the muscle cell, is actually tiny. It would only last for maybe a second or two of intense contraction.
Really? That's it. So how do we keep moving?
That's where the backup systems come in. The muscle has other, faster ways to quickly regenerate ATP right on the spot.
Okay, like what?
The very first responder is the phosphagen system. This relies on another high-energy molecule stored in muscle called creatine phosphate, or phosphocreatine.
Ah, creatine. People take supplements for that.
Exactly. So muscle cells store phosphocreatine. When ATP gets broken down to ADP during contraction, an enzyme called creatine kinase quickly grabs the phosphate from phosphocreatine and slaps it back onto the ADP, instantly regenerating ATP.
Super fast recharge.
Incredibly fast. It's the fastest way the muscle has to make ATP. This system is dominant during very short, explosive efforts, like a weightlifter's single lift, or the first few seconds of an all-out sprint.
So that initial burst of power.
Precisely. But the amount of phosphocreatine stored is also limited. It can probably fuel maximum effort for, say, up to 10 seconds, maybe a bit more, depending on the person, and intensity.
Okay, so it buys you a few crucial seconds.
It does. And there are other related reactions, too, involving enzymes like adenylyl kinase and AMP deaminase that help manage the energy balance during these intense bursts. But the creatine kinase reaction is the main player in this phosphagen system.
Now, you mentioned warming up earlier. How does that affect this system?
That's really interesting. Research, like the sprint study we looked at, suggests that a high-intensity warm-up actually primes this phosphagen system.
Primes it how?
It seemed to make it contribute even more energy during the subsequent sprint. In that study, after a high-intensity warm-up, the phosphagen system accounted for about 70% of the energy for a 100-meter sprint.
70% compared to...
Compared to about 61% after just a low-intensity warm-up. So that intense warm-up really revved up the immediate energy pathway.
Wow. So warm-ups aren't just about getting loose. They're about optimizing energy delivery right from the start.
Seems that way, especially for short, powerful activities. It gets the enzymes working and maybe improves the availability or utilization of phosphocreatine somehow.
Okay, phosphagen system covers the first few seconds of intense effort. What happens when we need to keep going hard for longer than, say, 10, 15 seconds, like a 200 or 400-meter run?
Right. The phosphagen system starts to deplete. That's when the next system really ramps up. The glycolytic system, or anaerobic glycolysis.
Glycolysis,
Right.
breaking down sugar, right?
Exactly. Glyco refers to glucose. Lysis means splitting. This pathway breaks down glucose, either glucose circulating in the blood or, more importantly, during intense exercise, glucose stored in the muscle as glycogen.
And this happens without oxygen. Anaerobic.
Correct. This process doesn't directly use oxygen, and it happens in the cytoplasm of the cell, outside the mitochondria. It's faster than aerobic metabolism, but not as fast as the phosphagen system.
So it's the middle speed option?
Kind of. It can produce ATP quite rapidly, making it crucial for high-intensity activities lasting from maybe 10-15 seconds up to a minute or two. Think of things like a 400-meter sprint or repeated high-intensity intervals in team sports.
How does it make ATP? Does it make a lot?
It involves a series of enzymatic steps. There's an initial investment phase where it actually uses a couple of ATP molecules to get the glucose ready.
You have to spend energy to make energy.
In this case, yes, initially. But then comes the payoff phase, where it generates more ATP than it consumed, resulting in a net gain of ATP from each glucose molecule. It's not a huge amount compared to aerobic metabolism, but it's fast.
Okay. And this is where lactate comes in, right? Lactic acid.
Yes. When glycolysis runs very quickly, like during intense exercise, the end product is often lactate. Now, for years, lactate was blamed for muscle fatigue and soreness, the lactic acid burn.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that.
But our understanding has really evolved. Lactate itself isn't necessarily the bad guy causing fatigue directly. In fact, it's an important fuel source. Other muscles, the heart, even the brain can take up lactate and use it for energy.
So it's not just waste.
Not at all. It's shuttled around the body. However, during very intense exercise, the production of lactate happens alongside the release of hydrogen ions, which do increase acidity, lowering the pH within the muscle cell.
Ah, so it's the acidity, not the lactate itself.
Largely, yes. That increased acidity, or acidosis, can interfere with muscle contraction and maybe some key enzymes involved in glycolysis itself. So while lactate isn't the direct cause, its rapid production is linked to the conditions that can contribute to fatigue during high-intensity anaerobic efforts.
That makes more sense. That burning feeling is more about the acid buildup.
That seems to be a major factor, yes. And interestingly, going back to that sprint warm-up study,
Did the intense warm-up affect glycolysis too?
it did. It significantly increased the contribution from the glycolytic system during the 100-meter sprint. It went from providing about 16.5% of the energy after a low-intensity warm-up to nearly 25% after the high-intensity one.
So the intense warm-up boosted both the immediate phosphagen system and the slightly slower glycolytic system.
Exactly. It seemed to prepare the muscle to utilize both anaerobic pathways more effectively for that short maximal effort.
That's fascinating. Are there ways to deal with that lactate buildup or acidity after exercise?
People are definitely researching that. Some strategies explored include things like active recovery light exercise after the intense bout, which seems to help clear lactate faster than just sitting still.
Okay.
There's also research into things like oxygen inhalation, though the benefits might be context dependent, and even dietary supplements like certain amino acids or bicarbonate that might help buffer the acidity or speed up lactate metabolism. But the science is still evolving there.
Right. Okay, so we have the super fast phosphagen system for seconds, then glycolysis kicks in for efforts up to maybe a couple of minutes. What about longer durations? Steady runs, cycling, swimming, team sports that go on for a while?
For anything beyond those initial couple of minutes of high intensity, and especially for submaximal, steady-state exercise or even high-intensity interval training with recovery periods, the primary source of ATP regeneration becomes aerobic metabolism.
Aerobic meaning with oxygen.
Exactly. This is the process that happens inside the mitochondria, the powerhouses. It uses oxygen to completely break down fuel sources, mainly carbohydrates, glucose and glycogen, and fats, to produce a lot of ATP.
Way more than glycolysis.
Oh, vastly more. Per molecule of glucose, aerobic metabolism yields many times more ATP than anaerobic glycolysis. It's much more efficient, but it's also slower to get going and requires a constant supply of oxygen.
This is our endurance engine then.
Absolutely. This system, primarily through a process called oxidative phosphorylation, OXPHOS, is what allows us to sustain activity for extended periods, from a 5K run to a marathon to hours of hiking.
What are the main steps involved? It sounds complex.
It is quite complex, involving several interconnected stages. After initial breakdown steps, molecules derived from carbs and fats enter the mitochondria and feed into the tricarboxylic acid cycle, or TCA cycle. You might also know it as the Krebs cycle.
Krebs cycle, yeah, heard of that one too.
This cycle is like a central hub. It further processes these fuel molecules, and in doing so, it achieves a couple of key things. One, it directly produces a small amount of ATP, or a similar molecule called GTP, in one specific step, the conversion of succinyl-CoA to succinate.
Okay, a little bit of direct ATP.
A little bit, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But more importantly, the TCA cycle generates a lot of high-energy electron carriers molecules called NADH and FADH2.
Electron carrier.
Think of them like shuttle buses carrying high-energy electrons stripped from the fuel molecules. These shuttles then deliver their electrons to the next stage, which is the electron transport chain, ETC, also located in the intermitochondrial membrane.
Right next to ATP synthase?
Exactly. The ETC is a series of protein complexes. As electrons are passed down this chain, like a bucket brigade, energy is released. This energy is used to pump protons, hydrogen ions, across the inner mitochondrial membrane, creating a gradient like water building up behind a dam.
Okay, creating potential energy.
Precisely. And then ATP synthase acts like the turbine in the dam. It allows those protons to flow back across the membrane, down their gradient, and it harnesses the energy of that flow to stick phosphate back onto ADP, generating lots and lots of ATP. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor at the end of the chain, which is why this whole process is aerobic.
Wow. Okay, so TCA cycle preps the fuel and loads the electron carriers. ETC uses the electrons to build a proton dam, and ATP synthase lets the protons flow back through to make ATP.
That's a great way to summarize it. And remember that enzyme succinate dehydrogenase. It's involved in converting succinate in the TCA cycle.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually also part of complex 2 of the electron transport chain. So it provides a direct physical link between the TCA cycle and the ETC, right there in the mitochondrial membrane.
It's all tightly integrated.
Very much so. Now, while this aerobic system is powerful, it doesn't switch on instantaneously at full blast when you start exercising.
Right. You mentioned a delay. Why is that?
There can be several potential limiting factors, especially at the start of moderate to high-intensity exercise. Things like the availability of certain molecules, like acetyl-CoA, a key entry point into the TCA cycle, which can be transported via acetylcarnitine, and the activation state of key enzymes in the TCA cycle and ETC can influence how quickly ATP production ramps up.
So it takes a moment for the whole factory to get up to speed.
Essentially, yes. Interestingly, the calcium ions that are released inside muscle cells to trigger contraction also play a role here. They can actually stimulate some of the key enzymes in the TCA cycle, helping to match ATP production with the increased demand during exercise.
So the signal to contract also helps signal the need for more energy production. Clever.
It's a very elegant system. Another point is fuel choice. While both carbs and fats fuel aerobic metabolism, the intensity of exercise influences which one is preferred.
How so?
At lower intensities, fat oxidation is a major contributor. We have vast stores of fat, making it ideal for long, slow activities. But as intensity increases, the body shifts towards using more carbohydrates, glucose, and glycogen.
Why the shift?
Carbohydrates can be broken down and fed into the aerobic pathways a bit more quickly than fats. Also, factors like the availability of carnitine, which is needed to transport fatty acids into the mitochondria, might become limiting at higher intensities, making carbs the more readily available fuel for rapid aerobic ATP production.
Got it. So faster pace means burning more sugar, even aerobically.
Generally speaking, yes, that balance shifts.
Okay, we focus heavily on muscle, which makes sense for exercise. But ATP isn't just for muscles, is it? What about all the other things cells do?
Absolutely not. Muscles are huge energy consumers. But every cell in your body uses ATP for countless tasks. Remember, we said it's the universal energy currency.
Right.
So think about active transport pumping ions and molecules across cell membranes against their concentration gradients, like the sodium-potassium pump, which is crucial for nerve function and maintaining cell volume. That pump alone can use a significant chunk of the cell's ATP.
Just maintaining gradients takes energy.
A lot of energy. Then there's synthesis, building complex molecules from simpler ones, making proteins, DNA, RNA, fats, carbohydrates. All these building processes require energy input, and ATP provides it.
So cell growth and repair depend on ATP.
Critically. Also, think about nerve impulse transmission. Maintaining the electrical potential across nerve cell membranes and releasing neurotransmitters requires ATP. Even simple things like cell movement or changing cell shape rely on ATP powering the internal cytoskeleton.
It sounds like almost nothing happens in a cell without ATP paying the bill.
That's pretty close to the truth. The way it usually works is through that process called phosphorylation we mentioned earlier. ATP transfers its terminal phosphate group to another molecule.
Like handing over the energy packet.
Exactly. Adding that phosphate group often energizes the recipient molecule, making it more reactive or causing it to change shape, which then allows the specific cellular task to occur. Specialized enzymes, called kinases, are often involved in catalyzing these phosphorylation reactions, coupling the energy release from ATP to the energy-requiring process.
This is energy coupling.
Yes, using an energy-releasing exergonic reaction, like ATP hydrolysis, to drive an energy-requiring inorganic reaction that wouldn't happen spontaneously. It's a fundamental principle of how cells manage energy.
Okay, so ATP is the universal energy broker for all cellular work, not just muscle contraction. Now, let's circle back to exercise and really contrast those extremes. The sprinter versus the marathon runner. How does their ATP supply strategy differ based on what we've discussed?
It's a fantastic contrast that highlights the different systems. For the sprinter, aiming for maximum power output over, say, 10-15 seconds.
Like a 100-meter dash.
Exactly. The primary goal is ATP production rate. How fast can you make it? So they rely almost entirely on the anaerobic systems. The phosphagen system, ADP-PCR, dominates the first few seconds, providing the most rapid ATP regeneration.
Instant power.
Yes. Then, as phosphocreatine levels drop, anaerobic glycolysis ramps up significantly to continue producing ATP quickly, though not quite as fast as the phosphagen system. The aerobic system contributes very little during such a short maximal burst because it's just too slow to get going and meet that intense demand.
So for the sprinter, phosphagen first, then glycolysis takes over more. Limited duration, high power.
Precisely. The total amount of ATP produced is relatively small, but it's produced extremely rapidly. Now, flip to the marathon runner.
Okay, hours of sustained effort.
Here, the game changes completely. The total amount of energy required is enormous. Remember that 80 kilogram estimate?
Still boggles my mind. 80 kilograms of ATP turnover.
It's immense. So the marathon runner cannot rely on the limited capacity of the anaerobic systems. They need sustained ATP production for hours. The absolute dominant player here is aerobic metabolism oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria.
Using oxygen, burning carbs and fats?
Correct. They need to generate ATP relatively steadily over a very long period. While the rate of ATP production is much lower than in sprinting, the total capacity is vastly greater because we have large fuel reserves, especially fat.
So marathon running is almost entirely an aerobic event energy-wise.
Overwhelmingly so. They'll be using a mix of carbohydrates, glycogen stores and blood glucose, and fats. The exact mix depends on intensity, duration, fitness level, and nutrition, but both are crucial fuel sources being fed into the TCA cycle and electron transport chain.
And this relates to hitting the wall.
Very much so. Hitting the wall, or bonking, often corresponds to severe depletion of the body's glycogen stores, particularly in the muscles and liver.
Running out of the fast-burning fuel.
Exactly. While the body still has plenty of fat reserves, relying solely on fat oxidation to produce ATP might not support the same pace or intensity. The rate of ATP generation from fat can be slightly slower, and it also requires carbohydrates to be processed efficiently, sometimes stated as fat burns in a carbohydrate flame. So, when glycogen runs critically low, the ability to maintain the desired pace plummets.
Makes sense. You lose the high-octane fuel.
You do. And during such prolonged exercise, the body also tries to help out. The liver ramps up gluconeogenesis, making new glucose from other sources like lactate, amino acids like alanine shuttled from muscle, and glycerol from fat breakdown to try and maintain blood glucose levels for the brain and working muscles.
How's the body trying to make its own sugar?
Yes, but this process also has limits and can't fully compensate for depleted glycogen stores during intense, prolonged effort. This is why fueling strategies, taking in carbohydrates during a marathon, are so important.
And this also connects to that train low idea you mentioned, training with low-carb stores.
It does. The idea behind train lows, compete high, is that by occasionally training in a glycogen-depleted state, you might stimulate adaptations in the muscle that enhance its ability to oxidize fat for fuel.
Making it better at using fat.
Potentially, yes. Enhancing mitochondrial biogenesis, increasing fat transport proteins, things like that. The goal is to make the athlete more metabolically flexible and perhaps spare glycogen stores during competition. It's a complex strategy with potential benefits, but also risks if not implemented carefully.
Right, needs careful planning. This concept of shifting fuel use really brings us to metabolic flexibility, doesn't it?
It really does. Metabolic flexibility is this capacity of the body, particularly muscles, to efficiently switch between oxidizing carbohydrates and fats depending on what's available and what the demand is. ATP production is absolutely central to this.
So being able to use the right fuel at the right time?
Exactly. Think about the fed state versus the fasted state. After a carbohydrate-rich meal, insulin levels rise, promoting glucose uptake and oxidation. Your cells preferentially burn carbs for ATP. Simultaneously, fat oxidation is suppressed.
Using the readily available sugar.
Right. But then, if you fast overnight or engage in prolonged low-intensity exercise, insulin levels drop, other hormones rise, and your cells shift towards breaking down stored fat and oxidizing fatty acids to generate ATP.
Switching to fat burning.
That switch is metabolic flexibility. The Randle cycle, or glucose fatty acid cycle, is a concept that helps explain this interplay, how the increased availability and breakdown of one fuel source can inhibit the breakdown and utilization of the other.
So they compete, in a way.
There's a regulatory crosstalk, yes. And the mitochondria are really the orchestrators of this, being the site where both fatty acids and the products of glucose breakdown are ultimately oxidized for ATP production via the TCA cycle and ETC.
So healthy mitochondria are key for metabolic flexibility.
They are absolutely crucial. And importantly, a loss of metabolic flexibility, the inability to switch fuels appropriately, is increasingly recognized as a hallmark of metabolic diseases like insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and type 2 diabetes.
So it's not just about athletic performance, it's about overall metabolic health.
Definitely. The ability to adapt fuel use to supply ATP efficiently according to conditions is fundamental to health.
We've talked about the different systems and fuel choices, but how is all this ATP production actually controlled? It seems like it needs tight regulation.
It absolutely does. The cell needs to match ATP supply very closely to ATP demand, which can change dramatically and rapidly, especially in muscle. It's regulated at multiple levels. Well, substrate availability is a major factor. How much glucose, glycogen, or fatty acids are available to enter the pathways? That's a basic control.
Makes sense. You need the raw materials.
Then there's the energy state of the cell itself. The relative concentrations of ATP, ADP, and AMP adenosine monophosphate act as signals. High ADP and AMP levels generally indicate low energy charge and stimulate ATP-producing pathways. High ATP levels signal high energy charge and tend to inhibit these pathways.
So the products of energy used signal the need for more production. Feedback loops.
Exactly, classic feedback regulation. Oxygen availability is obviously critical for aerobic metabolism. If oxygen is limited, aerobic ATP production slows down, and anaerobic glycolysis might increase.
Right, the aerobic engine needs oxygen.
Hormonal signals are also key regulators. We mentioned insulin promoting glucose uptake and use. Other hormones like glucagon and adrenaline epinephrine generally promote the breakdown of stored fuels, glycogen and fat, to make substrates available for ATP production, especially during fasting or stress like exercise.
So hormones orchestrate fuel availability across the whole body.
They play a major role in coordinating metabolic responses.
Right.
And then there are controls within the pathways themselves, key enzymes whose activity is regulated by various factors, including the energy signals, ATP PAM, substrate availability, and sometimes calcium, as we discussed for the TCA cycle. It's a really complex, integrated network of control.
It sounds incredibly fine-tuned. One last quick point: I've sometimes heard ATP mentioned in relation to cell signaling. Is that different from its energy role?
Yes, that's another fascinating aspect, though maybe a bit beyond our main focus today based on the sources. ATP itself and its breakdown products like ADP and adenosine can actually be released from cells and act as signaling molecules.
Signaling? How?
They can bind to specific receptors on the surface of the same cell or neighboring cells and trigger various responses. This is known as purinergic signaling. For example, adenosine is well known for its role in promoting sleep and drowsiness in the brain, and it also affects blood flow and inflammation.
So ATP isn't just an internal fuel, it can be an external signal too.
It can be, yes. It adds another layer of complexity to its roles in the body. But for today's deep dive, focusing on its primary role as the energy currency for cellular work and muscle contraction gives us plenty to chew on.
Absolutely. Okay, let's try and wrap this up. We've covered a huge amount of ground on ATP. If you had to boil it down, what are the absolute key takeaways about its overarching roles?
Okay, number one, ATP is truly the universal energy currency inside cells. It captures chemical energy from food breakdown and releases it in a controlled way to power nearly all cellular activities.
The fundamental fuel.
Yes. Number two, it's a direct fuel for muscle contraction, powering the interaction of actin and myosin filaments that creates movement, essential for everything from blinking to sprinting.
Powering movement.
Third, the body has multiple systems to regenerate ATP, each suited for different demands. The rapid but short-lived Phosphagen System, the faster anaerobic glycolysis, and the high-capacity but slower aerobic metabolism. Our ability to perform different types of activity depends on the interplay of these systems.
Different gears for different speeds and duration.
Exactly. And fourth, ATP production and fuel selection are intricately linked to metabolic flexibility, the body's crucial ability to adapt energy metabolism based on fuel availability and demand, which is vital for both performance and overall health.
Energy currency, muscle power, multiple supply systems, and metabolic flexibility. Got it.
Those are the big ones, I think.
And that mind-blowing fact about the sheer amount used, 80 kilograms during a marathon, that really sticks with you. It underscores just how incredibly active and demanding our bodies are at the cellular level, constantly making and using this energy molecule.
It really puts it in perspective, doesn't it? It's not static. It's this constant, massive flow of energy conversion happening trillions of times a second throughout your body.
So when listeners think about their own energy levels or their performance in sports or even just getting through the day, understanding ATP really gives a foundational insight into what's happening under the hood.
Absolutely. It connects directly to nutrition. What fuels are you providing? To training, how are you conditioning these energy systems? And even to rest and recovery, allowing the body to replenish and repair.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe. Considering how complex and vital this ATP generation and usage is, what other, maybe less obvious parts of our daily lives could be impacting this cellular energy landscape? Things we might not even connect to energy.
That's a great question to ponder. Think about chronic stress, sleep quality, inflammation levels, maybe even the microbiome in our gut. Research is increasingly showing links between these broader aspects of our physiology and mitochondrial function, metabolic health, and ultimately our ability to efficiently produce and utilize ATP.
So the energy story might be even bigger and more interconnected than we typically think.
It almost certainly is. And as science keeps digging deeper into the nuances of ATP metabolism, mitochondrial health, and metabolic signaling, we're likely to see new strategies emerge, not just for athletes, but for everyone looking to optimize their energy, health, and maybe even longevity.
Definitely food for thought. And for anyone whose curiosity is really piqued by this,
Yeah, there's so much more to explore. You could dive deeper into mitochondrial biology specifically, or get into the nitty-gritty of the different metabolic pathways like glycolysis or the TCA cycle, or explore the huge field of sports nutrition and how different diets impact fuel use and ATP production. It's a fascinating world.